truck swayed gently as it rumbled down the long, empty road. The sound of its engine was the only noise that filled the air, muffling the heavy silence inside. Lena Fisher sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her body numb from exhaustion. The bitter cold still clung to her bones, but it was nothing compared to the long months of fear and uncertainty she had already endured. It had been days since their capture, since the brutal surrender of her unit. Now, she and the other women, soldiers, medics, and support staff, were bound together in their shared fate. They were prisoners of war. The women were all in the back of the truck, huddled in small groups, each one lost in her thoughts, each one struggling to comprehend what had happened. Most of them had been a part of the German war effort, some veterans, others younger recruits who had never expected to be captured, let alone treated with the strange kindness they had encountered since the moment of their surrender. But for Lena, everything felt like an impossibility, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. Her once pristine uniform was now stained with dirt in the weight of hardship, her face pale from the cold, her lips cracked from dehydration. She could hear the soft murmur of the other women talking in hushed voices, their words barely audible over the sound of the truck's engine. They were discussing the food, specifically the food they hadn't had in so long. Lena's stomach growled painfully. It had been days since they'd had a proper meal, and the hunger gnawed at her with each passing hour. She thought back to the sparse rations they had been given before their capture, the half-eaten scraps, the stale bread, and the thin soup that was all they had for sustenance. Now, as they drove deeper into the unknown, it felt as though the idea of food, real food, was an alien concept. The truck began to slow, and Lena looked out the side window, squinting against the bright sunlight that cut through the haze of the day. The landscape had changed. The barren, frost-covered fields of Germany were gone, replaced by something different, something that made her heart tighten with confusion. She wasn't sure where they were going, but the town ahead seemed strangely peaceful, almost untouched by the horrors of the war. The truck rolled to a stop, and the sound of the engine died away. Lena hesitated for a moment before standing and following the others as they were ushered out of the vehicle. The guards, American soldiers, were standing around them, their expressions unreadable. But their eyes, Lena noticed, didn't carry the hatred she had expected. There was no venom in their gaze, no malice. Instead, there was something else, a curiosity perhaps, or even a hint of pity. Lena and the others were led through a quiet, small town. The houses here were neat, the streets well maintained. There was an air of normalcy about the place that felt surreal. It seemed like a world so far removed from the hell they had known in the war. The endless destruction, the constant bombardment, the terror that had ruled their every step. Here in this town, the world seemed to breathe differently. It was quieter, kinder. They were led to a building with a large sign above the door. Lena couldn't read the word from the distance, but as they got closer, she saw it clearly. Supermarket. She stopped in her tracks. A supermarket. The word alone seemed foreign, alien. She had heard of them, of course. She had seen them in magazines and newspapers before the war. But to see one now, at a time like this, was unfathomable. In her mind, a supermarket was a place of abundance, a place where people could pick and choose from shelves stacked high with food. But that was a dream, wasn't it? Something from another life. The women were directed inside, and Lena felt a strange sense of disbelief wash over her. She had been prepared for cold barracks, for more of the suffering she had already endured. But this was something she had never imagined. Inside, the store was warm, the bright fluorescent lights illuminating rows and rows of food. There were fruits, apples, oranges, bananas, cans of vegetables, jars of jams, loaves of bread, meats, fresh cuts of it, wrapped neatly in plastic. The sight was overwhelming. Lena's heart raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. Was this real? Was it a dream? She had gone months without seeing fresh produce, and now here it was, in abundance, sitting before her like some strange illusion. Her mind struggled to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. She had seen death, destruction, and starvation for so long that this wealth, this simple, everyday normality, felt like a slap in the face. "Take what you need," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was an American soldier, a young man who had been standing nearby. He smiled at her, though there was something almost shy in his expression. "Go ahead, it's yours." Lena hesitated. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She was a prisoner. She wasn't supposed to take anything. She wasn't supposed to accept kindness from the enemy who had destroyed so much of her life. But her body, her aching, starving body, knew nothing of loyalty or pride. It only knew hunger. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the shelf. She pulled a can of peaches from the shelf, the cool metal feeling heavy in her hands. She stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. The soldier was still watching her, his expression soft, waiting. Behind her, Greta, the older woman who had been a medic during the war, moved past Lena and began filling her own arms with food. At first she moved slowly, cautiously, as if expecting someone to stop her, but as she glanced back at Lena, she gave a small, knowing nod. It was as if she was silently reassuring Lena. This was their reality now, and there was no shame in accepting the kindness offered. Lena swallowed hard, her fingers curling tighter around the can. She had been so accustomed to scarcity, to rationing, to living in a world where every crumb was earned. But here, in this strange, foreign place, food was given freely, with no expectation of repayment, no barter. It was simply offered. And for the first time in months, Lena's stomach began to settle as she took the first tentative steps forward, filling her arms with whatever she could carry. The others were already filling their baskets, some of them laughing, others still too stunned to speak. It was a surreal sight. Women who had once been soldiers, once part of an army that had devastated countries, now standing in a place of abundance, accepted as something other than enemies. But as Lena moved through the aisles, picking up cans and packets, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The soldier who had spoken to her earlier was still there, watching them quietly from across the room. His gaze wasn't stern or commanding. It was something else, something that made Lena feel exposed, vulnerable, and yet strangely relieved. She wanted to ask him why. Why were they being treated like this? Why were they being given food, kindness, after everything their country had done? But instead she kept moving, her body instinctively filling her basket with food, with the nourishment her body had been craving. Each item was a small, comforting gesture. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a tin of beans. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. And yet, as she filled her basket, there was a nagging thought at the back of her mind, a question that would not let go. What is the price of this kindness? She pushed the thought aside for now, but as they were led out of the store and toward the waiting trucks, Lena knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be as simple as just accepting food. The real test was yet to come. The days that followed their arrival in the small American town were filled with an unsettling sense of both relief and unease. Lena woke each morning to the sound of birdsong, the sun streaming in through the small windows of the barracks. But the comfort of these peaceful mornings was always overshadowed by the reality of their captivity. The women, though grateful for their survival, were not accustomed to kindness, at least not the kind they were now being shown by their captors. The food they had been given in the supermarket had been a momentary reprieve, an act of generosity that felt almost impossible to believe. Every bite was a gift, and yet, with each meal, the guilt that accompanied it grew heavier. Lena couldn't shake the thought that it was a trap, an offering to soften their resolve, to break them down. The Americans were offering them food, warmth, and shelter. But what did they want in return? What was the cost of their survival? The barracks were small, their walls bare except for a few tattered American flags and some basic supplies. The conditions were infinitely better than the cold, cramped transport trucks, and the women had more than enough food to fill their bellies for the first time in months. Yet as the days went by, the tension between gratitude and suspicion only grew. Lena spent much of her time in the corner of the barracks, trying to ignore the conversations around her. The other women were more willing to accept their new reality, but not Lena. She couldn't ignore the questions swirling in her mind, nor could she silence the growing unease in her gut. Could it be that they were really being treated with respect? Or were they being subtly manipulated, their every move watched as part of a larger strategy? Her thoughts were interrupted one afternoon when she was sitting by the window, watching the soldiers outside as they worked on maintenance around the camp. Lena had long noticed the strange duality of the American soldiers. Some were kind and approachable, others distant and stern. It was hard for her to reconcile the warmth they had shown her and her comrades with the memory of their country's actions in the war. "Lena, come here." Greta's voice pulled her from her reverie. "We need to talk." Lena stood up reluctantly, feeling the weight of the question that loomed between them. Greta had been a medic during the war, and although she was older than most of the other women, she had always been a stabilizing force in their group. But the lines on her face were deep now, her eyes shadowed with a kind of weary understanding. "What is it?" Lena asked, her voice low. Greta motioned for her to sit. "I've been talking to the others. They're starting to get comfortable here. They're forgetting who they are. They think it's over, that we're safe." Lena's chest tightened. "Isn't that a good thing? They deserve to feel safe." "Of course they do," Greta said, her voice quiet but firm. "But you can't let your guard down completely. We're prisoners, Lena. This isn't freedom. They're giving us food and shelter. But for what? To make us forget who we are. To break us down piece by piece." Lena frowned, shaking her head. "But what else can we do? We're not soldiers anymore. We're just trying to survive." Greta's eyes locked onto hers, her gaze filled with an intensity that Lena couldn't ignore. "Exactly, survive. But surviving doesn't mean forgetting everything you've been through. It doesn't mean pretending that they're your friends when you're still their prisoners. We have to stay vigilant." Lena's thoughts swirled, caught between the comfort of a peaceful life and the harsh reality of what Greta was saying. The tension was starting to crack the veneer of normalcy they had been allowed to build here. Every meal, every moment of kindness from the Americans now felt tainted by a growing suspicion. Were they being given this freedom to soften them, to make them compliant, or was it genuine? As the days passed, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The soldiers, those that had shown kindness, were growing distant again. The supplies were still abundant, the food never running out, but the Americans' expressions were shifting. There was something about the way they watched them now, something that felt like they were waiting for them to do something. The tipping point came one night when Lena and Greta were walking back to the barracks after a long day. The air was crisp, and the light of the moon illuminated the snowy ground beneath their feet. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. "We need to get out of here," Greta said suddenly, her voice low, barely a whisper. "We can't wait forever." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I've heard the rumors," Greta continued, her voice shaking slightly. "They're going to send us somewhere else. Another camp. I don't know if they'll keep us safe there. This might be our only chance." Lena's mind reeled. The thought of escape had crossed her mind a few times, but she had dismissed it, thinking it was impossible. They were prisoners. What good would it do to run? But Greta's words had sparked something inside her, a sense of urgency that she couldn't ignore. "We can't leave. Not now," Lena said, her voice uncertain. "If we try, we'll be hunted down." Greta stopped walking, turning to face Lena. "And if we don't try, we'll be stuck here forever, treated like nothing. We'll be prisoners, yes, but we'll still have a chance at survival, real survival. You don't want to live like this forever, do you?" Lena's breath caught in her throat. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the camp, the warmth of the food, the semblance of peace they had been granted, felt like a betrayal. But Greta was right. This wasn't freedom. It was just another form of captivity. The walls may have been different, but they were still prisoners. "What if we fail?" Lena asked softly. "Then we fail," Greta replied. "But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have our dignity." The words hit Lena harder than she had expected. Dignity. They had been stripped of it the moment they had surrendered. But was that all they had left? Was that the one thing worth fighting for? The decision weighed on her, every ounce of her being torn between fear and the desire for freedom. If they escaped, if they ran, what would happen? Would they be caught? Would they be punished for their defiance? But as Lena glanced at the faces of the women around her, faces that had been marked by war, by loss, by fear. She knew the answer. They couldn't stay here forever. They couldn't just accept the kindness of the Americans and live in silence, pretending they were no longer prisoners. There was something more they could do, something more they deserved. She nodded slowly. We'll do it, but we need to be careful. We can't risk everyone. We need to find a way out, quietly. Greta's face softened, her lips curling into a small smile. We'll do it together. As they stood there in the dark, the wind whispering through the trees, the weight of their decision hung in the air. But Lena knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, this was the moment that would change everything. They had chosen their path, and there was no turning back. Tension lingered in the air as Lena and Greta made their plans. But even as the camp seemed calm, as the women accepted the food and shelter given to them, the threat of the unknown loomed ever closer. The soldiers' distant gazes told them all they needed to know. Something was coming, and they had no choice but to be ready. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next as Lena and Greta quietly solidified their plan. The camp, with its seemingly peaceful facade, had become a prison once more in their eyes. Despite the kindness they had been shown, despite the food and shelter, the walls of captivity had never felt more real. It wasn't the physical confinement that troubled Lena. It was the slow realization that they were still at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The thought of escape had begun to take root in Lena's mind, and with it, a growing sense of urgency. The decision was no longer a distant notion. It was an impending reality. Greta, determined and unwavering, had found a possible route. The camp wasn't as secure as it appeared. There were gaps in the fences, sections of the perimeter that could be breached, but it wouldn't be easy. The guards had become more vigilant, the tension among the American soldiers palpable. It seemed as if they knew something was brewing, though they hadn't spoken of it aloud. On the eve of their escape, Lena sat in the barracks, staring out at the night sky. The stars were bright above, a cold, distant reminder of the world beyond, the world they had lost. Her fingers trembled slightly as she thought about the decision ahead. Could she really leave everything behind? The comfort of the barracks, the relative safety, even if it was under the control of the enemy. Could she throw it all away for a chance at freedom, for an uncertain future? Greta's voice broke the silence, her words low but urgent. It's time. Lena's heart raced. Tonight? Greta nodded. Yes. If we wait any longer, we'll miss our chance. The guards change shifts in 2 hours. That's when we move. Lena stood up, her legs stiff from sitting for too long, and walked toward the small window. The camp was quiet, the faint glow of lights dotting the perimeter, the guards walking in their usual circles. But there was a sense of expectation in the air, a feeling that tonight would be different. It was now or never. What about the others? Lena asked, her voice tight with doubt. We can't take everyone, Greta replied. It's too risky. If we bring too many, we'll be caught before we even reach the fence. We'll need to move fast and quiet. The fewer of us, the better. Lena nodded slowly, but the weight of the decision pressed down on her chest. They couldn't take everyone. And even worse, there were some in the camp who were already too comfortable, who had accepted their captivity as a new normal, who had begun to believe that they had nothing to fear anymore. Those women wouldn't come with them. I'll go with you, Greta said firmly, her voice offering no room for hesitation. We can make it. We just need to trust each other. And trust, Lena realized, was all they had left. As the minutes passed, the camp seemed to close in around her. It was no longer just a physical space. They had to escape the psychological grip it had on them as well. The Americans had been kind, but kindness wasn't freedom. And Lena realized that no matter how much food they were given, no matter how many smiles the soldiers offered, they could never truly be free until they made their own escape. Just as Lena began to gather herself for the mission ahead, a knock came at the door. The knock was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down Lena's spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward Greta, who stood frozen, her hand hovering over the door handle. What is it? Lena whispered. Greta's face had gone pale, her hand trembling as she slowly approached the door. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely audible. It could be anything. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. The timing could not have been worse. They couldn't afford to be discovered now. It wasn't just their lives at stake. It was everything they had worked for. They had to go. Before Greta could open the door, a voice came from the other side, soft but unmistakable. Lena? Greta? It was the officer, the one who had spoken to them so kindly when they first arrived. Lena's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected him to find them here. Not tonight. Not like this. Lena, the officer repeated, his voice carrying a quiet urgency. I need to speak with you. Please. Lena exchanged a look with Greta, who was still standing motionless, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The officer had always been different from the others. Kind, almost too kind. But Lena had learned to be wary of kindness. It could disguise manipulation, and it could mask control. Was this his way of finding out their plans? Had they been watched? Did he know what they were about to do? We need to go now, Greta whispered, her voice tight, before it's too late. But Lena hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. The officer's voice had a quality to it that she couldn't ignore. It was as though he knew something she didn't, something that had the potential to change everything. What if we talk to him? Lena asked, her voice low. What if he's not part of this? What if… Greta shook her head quickly, cutting her off. Lena, listen to me. We can't afford to trust him. We've already made our choice. The door handle shifted as the officer outside pressed against it, his voice rising with a sense of urgency. Lena, I know what you're thinking. You have to trust me. Please. Lena's chest tightened, torn between her gut instinct and the possibility that there was more to this than she could see. What if the officer was trying to help them? What if he was the ally they hadn't expected? But then it hit her. If they don't act now, they'll lose their chance. Go, Lena whispered, pushing past Greta toward the door. We don't have time. Greta shot her a worried glance, but she nodded and followed, her expression tense. Together, they moved quickly toward the small window at the back of the barracks. The door behind them creaked open just as they were about to climb through, and for a moment, Lena's heart stopped. Lena! The officer's voice rang out, desperate, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. With one last glance at the barracks, Lena slid through the window, followed closely by Greta. They hit the ground running, their feet crunching in the snow as they sprinted toward the fence. Every step felt like it could be their last. They were so close to the freedom they had been denied for so long. But behind them they heard a voice shout, a command. Stop! Lena's blood ran cold. She didn't look back. The fence was only yards away, and their hearts hammered in unison, each beat driving them forward. But something had changed. Had they been caught? Had the officer betrayed them? The sound of footsteps grew louder, but Lena pushed forward, ignoring the cramping in her legs, the fear clawing at her chest. They were almost there. Go! Greta shouted, urging her on. Don't stop! Lena's lungs burned as she raced for the fence, her fingers gripping the cold metal as she scaled it. There was no time to look back, no time to wonder if they had made the right choice. The stakes had never been higher. As she reached the top, she glanced down and saw Greta right behind her, her face determined but filled with a desperate urgency. And then, just as Lena was about to drop to the other side, the sound of a single gunshot rang out through the night. It was sharp, echoing in the stillness, and Lena's heart skipped a beat. But she didn't stop. Neither of them did. They were free. But at what cost? The gunshot shattered the stillness of the night, its sharp crack ricocheting through the air like a warning, a cry for help. Lena's body jerked as the sound reached her ears, but she didn't stop. Her feet hit the ground on the other side of the fence with a jarring thud, her legs momentarily giving way under the weight of the escape. She quickly regained her balance, her breath shallow as she looked back toward the camp. The outline of the barracks loomed in the distance, the flicker of searchlights sweeping through the trees. They had made it past the fence, but now they were exposed. There was nowhere to hide. Only the dark forest stretched ahead of them, cold, distant, and unforgiving. Lena, come on! Greta's voice broke through the tension in the air. She was already moving further into the woods, her steps swift and purposeful. The fear in her voice only pushed Lena forward, each step more urgent than the last. She had to keep moving. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled after Greta. The sounds of pursuit were growing closer. The soldiers were following them. They were running out of time. The further they ran, the more Lena realized that they were on their own now. There was no turning back. They had made the choice. Now they had to live with the consequences. But the price was becoming clearer with every step. As they reached the tree line, a flicker of movement in the distance caught Lena's eye. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. In the shadows of the trees there was a figure, another American soldier. His stance was rigid, his rifle aimed directly at them. "Stop!" the soldier called out, his voice clear and commanding. Lena's heart leapt into her throat. They had been spotted. The soldier's eyes were fixed on them, his finger tightening on the trigger. There was nowhere to go. The woods were thick, but not thick enough to hide them from his gaze. "Lena, run!" Greta shouted, her voice frantic. Without thinking, Lena turned and dashed deeper into the trees, her feet slipping in the wet underbrush. Every part of her screamed to stop, to surrender, to accept the reality of what they had done. But there was no time to think. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let it end here. She heard Greta's footsteps behind her, the other woman not far behind. They were running in tandem now, weaving through the trees, their bodies moving on pure adrenaline. The woods were thick, but it only made their escape feel more suffocating. They couldn't outrun the soldiers forever. They had to find a way to disappear. But then, another shout rang out from behind them. This time it wasn't a voice calling for them to stop. It was a gunshot. The sound echoed through the trees, the sharp crack of it vibrating in Lena's bones. She didn't stop. She couldn't. But something in the air shifted. There was no more running without consequences. The stakes had become painfully clear. They were close to being captured, or worse. Suddenly, a sharp cry split the night. Lena's heart lurched in her chest as she turned to see Greta stumble, her body collapsing to the ground. Her arm flailed as if reaching for something, anything, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She was down. "Greta!" Lena screamed, panic flooding her senses. Lena dashed back to her side, her legs screaming in protest. She didn't know if the soldiers had already caught up, if they were right behind her, but in that moment, all that mattered was Greta. Greta's face was pale, her lips barely moving as she struggled to breathe. Her leg was twisted awkwardly beneath her, a sickening crack in the air telling Lena everything she needed to know. She was hurt, badly. "Greta, hold on," Lena whispered, kneeling beside her. The words felt useless in her mouth. She didn't know what to do. She wasn't a doctor anymore. She was just a prisoner. Greta's hand reached up, grasping Lena's arm weakly. "Lena, you need to go. I'm not going to make it." Lena's heart shattered at the words. No, she couldn't leave her here. Not like this. "I'm not leaving you, Greta," Lena said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We'll get you to safety. Just hold on, please." But Greta shook her head slowly, her face twisted with pain. "You have to go. I'll only slow you down. They're coming. You won't make it if you stay." Lena's breath caught in her throat, the tears welling in her eyes. This was the moment she had feared from the beginning. She couldn't save Greta. She couldn't save them both. "Please, Greta," Lena pleaded. "We're so close. We can make it. You and me. You can't," Greta interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't stay for me. This is your chance. Take it." The words hit Lena like a slap to the face, each one harder to swallow than the last. Greta's eyes were tired, the weight of everything they had endured in those brief moments before her body finally gave way. "No!" Lena cried, her hands shaking as she held onto Greta's, the tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're my friend. I won't leave you." Greta's grip tightened for a moment, and she smiled weakly. "You have to, for both of us." The sound of boots approaching broke the fragile moment. Lena could hear the soldiers getting closer, their voices cutting through the stillness of the night. They were running out of time. Greta's face softened, the faintest flicker of peace in her eyes. "Go, Lena. Go now." Lena's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. But as Greta's hand slipped from her own, she knew what she had to do. She stood, taking one last look at her friend, her heart heavy with grief, with loss. There was no time for goodbyes, No time to hold on to the past. All Lena could do was run. Run for the life they had fought for. Run for the future that still awaited. With a final glance, Lena turned and sprinted into the darkness, the sound of soldiers chasing her, the echoes of Greta's last words ringing in her mind. And then, as she plunged deeper into the woods, the weight of her decision pressed down on her chest. She was alone now, alone in a world that seemed more uncertain than ever. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back. She had made it. But at what cost? Lena ran until her legs could no longer carry her, until her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps, until the weight of the world, the weight of everything that had happened, became too much to bear. She had escaped. She had survived. But at what cost? The night was cold and the forest around her seemed endless, each shadow in the trees a potential threat, each rustle in the underbrush a reminder that she was not truly free. But the pain in her chest, the guilt gnawing at her heart, was the most suffocating. She had left Greta behind. She had made the choice to run, to survive, and it had torn her apart. The image of Greta's face, pale and filled with pain, lingered in her mind. She could still hear Greta's words. Go. You have to. For both of us. But Lena hadn't been ready to let go. She wasn't ready to face the reality of what had just happened. The forest stretched on in every direction, its darkness swallowing her whole. Lena barely registered the passing of time. She moved on instinct, stumbling through the trees, her mind a blur of memories, of fear, of loss. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between herself and the soldiers. They would come after her. They would search. They had to. Hours passed before Lena found a small clearing where she finally collapsed to the ground, her legs trembling beneath her. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around them, trying to steady her breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But there was no escaping the pain, the guilt, the shame. She closed her eyes, but the image of Greta wouldn't leave her. It was as if the entire world had fallen away, and there was only Lena, alone in the woods, haunted by what she had done. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She had chosen to live, but in doing so, she had sacrificed someone who had fought beside her, someone who had been her friend. The crackling of leaves beneath heavy boots reached her ears before she saw them. Soldiers. American soldiers. Lena's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't move. She couldn't move. She was too exhausted, too defeated. They had found her. It was over. She had run for nothing. She wanted to close her eyes and let them take her. She wanted to let herself sink into the quiet darkness, into the oblivion of sleep, to escape the weight of what had happened. But just as she thought she might give up, a voice spoke, soft but urgent. Lena! Her head snapped up and she saw him, the same American soldier who had spoken to her in the supermarket. His face was calm, but his eyes held something else. Something warm, something that she hadn't expected to see. It was kindness. Lena, he said again, his voice low and steady. Are you all right? Lena couldn't speak. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She only nodded, her body trembling, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming emotions that surged through her. She had escaped, yes, but in doing so, she had left behind everything. Everything she had fought for, everything she had lost, and the one person who had believed in her. The soldier crouched down beside her, his expression softening. You're safe now, he said quietly. We're going to take care of you. Lena stared at him, her heart racing. Why? She whispered. Why help me? Why show me kindness after everything? The soldier's gaze shifted slightly, and for a moment, Lena thought she saw a flicker of something. Something like understanding, like sorrow. Because you're human, he said simply. And you deserve to be treated with dignity. All of you do. Lena's breath caught in her throat. His words were simple, but they pierced through her like nothing she had ever heard before. Dignity. For the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her. A fragile hope, a spark of something that had been buried beneath the weight of war, beneath the rubble of everything she had lost. I left her, Lena said in a broken whisper, her voice trembling with grief. I left Greta behind. The soldier didn't speak immediately. He just nodded slowly, as if he understood the depth of what Lena was saying. He didn't offer words of comfort. There was no attempt to excuse her actions or to sugarcoat the reality of the situation, but his silence, his presence felt like a balm to the rawness of her pain. He didn't judge her. She made her choice too, the soldier said quietly. You both did, and that's all anyone can ask for, to make your own choice. Lena looked up at him, the tears she had been holding back finally falling. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if there were any words that could make this right. The truth was, there was no way to undo what had been done. But there was something in his words that gave her pause. Her choice. It was a choice she had made to survive, to move forward, even if it meant leaving behind everything she had known. For the first time in a long while, Lena allowed herself to feel something other than guilt. She allowed herself to feel grief, yes, but also gratitude. She had survived, she had escaped, and for that, she was still alive. The soldier offered her his hand, a small gesture, but it meant more than words could express. He wasn't asking her to forget what had happened. He wasn't asking her to pretend that everything was fine. He was simply offering her a chance to take another step forward, to keep moving, even if it meant starting over. Lena took his hand, her grip shaky but steadying. She let him help her to her feet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel entirely alone. Inspired by the true accounts of American soldiers who showed extraordinary kindness to captured prisoners of war during World War II, even offering food and shelter to those who had once been their enemies. This story is a tribute to the quiet moments of humanity amidst the chaos of conflict.